Welcome to Testmaking and Assessment for English Teachers, sponsored by the Embassy of the United States and Akita International University. This is the third lecture of this series. In this lecture we will discuss methods for assessing speaking with a close look at rubric design. Before we talk about some specific methods for assessing speaking, we will go over a few points from assessment theory. First, we will discuss the distinction between speaking and communication. This is a useful distinction to keep in mind when we think about how we will design our assessment. Next, we will briefly discuss the difference between a direct test and an indirect test. Finally, we will briefly talk about the difference between objective and subjective scoring and how this affects reliability. First, let's talk about speaking versus communication. Are they different? If they are different, when or how are they different? Is speaking sometimes not communication? There is disagreement about these questions, but it can be a useful distinction when designing and evaluating assessments. Let me give some simple answers that can be helpful to teachers of communicative English. We can say that speaking is the act of making spoken sounds that are intelligible in a language. Intelligible means that a listener can understand the speaker's message without making a great effort. Some of the skills that we might look for when assessing speaking are pronunciation and intonation, using the correct word forms, using the correct word order, choosing appropriate vocabulary, and various other language skills. Oral communication, on the other hand, is using speech to exchange information. Oral communication, first of all, requires intelligible speaking, all the skills mentioned in the previous slide. However, communication requires a speaker and a listener, a sender and a receiver of information. Communication also requires that there be an exchange of information. This requires a focus on meaning, and that usually implies there is something that the receiver or listener does not know. So in that sense, is practicing a memorized dialogue communication? Maybe not. After all, the two partners do not need to understand the meaning of their dialogue. All they really need to do is listen for their partner to stop speaking. There are other skills, such as eye contact, body language, and gestures, that are said to be important for communication. But one very important skill is topic and flow management, also known as interaction. This large category includes turn-taking, signaling when you have finished speaking, starting new topics, and elaborating on current topics by asking questions or asking a speaker to repeat or clarify. We have made a distinction between speaking and communication. Let's pause for a few seconds while you consider whether these three speaking test formats are testing speaking skills, oral communication, or both. Pause the lecture if you wish to think for a bit longer. Have you considered your answers? There is room for honest disagreement, but generally we say that a prepared speech is a valid assessment for speaking skills, but not communication, because there is no interaction. Also, a speech performance requires preparation and memorization ability as well as speaking skill, so the assessment might be measuring attitude or motivation as well as speaking ability. A structured role play, such as instructing two students to invite their partner to a party, and give directions based on a map does allow for interaction. However, it also may involve rehearsal and memorization, which decreases its validity as an assessment of oral communication. Assessment designers must think carefully whether the topic of the role play will be announced in advance or announced just before the assessment begins. An observed spontaneous discussion by 3 to 4 students is probably the most valid and authentic assessment of oral communication. But as you can guess, there are challenges related to reliability and practicality. Another way to look at speaking assessment is micro skills versus macro skills. Brown and Abewick-Rama present a list of such skills on page 186 of Language Assessment. Micro skills include such things as producing phonemes accurately, producing chunks of fluent language, producing accurate grammatical forms, producing English stress patterns, and using cohesive devices in spoken language. Macro skills, on the other hand, refer to things such as accomplishing specific communicative functions, such as greetings, self-introductions, asking for and giving directions, etc. Other important macro skills are using appropriate styles, registers, conversation conventions, etc., using facial features and body language for communication, and using communication strategies, such as asking for clarification. From this perspective, we can say that micro skills and macro skills are both important. A valid test of communication requires both. However, for practical reasons, where we cannot arrange a test of interactive communication, we might focus on assessing micro skills only as an alternative. This brings us to the distinction between a direct and an indirect test. This distinction is related to the concept of micro skills and macro skills. A direct test is aimed directly at the skill we want to measure. For example, we might use an interview between a teacher and student, or a conversation between two students observed and evaluated by a teacher as a direct test of speaking ability. Because these two formats involve interaction, they could also be considered direct tests of oral communication. We could also use a rehearsed role play or prepared speech as direct tests of speaking. However, because these two formats do not involve interaction and are affected by preparation, they might not be valid tests of oral communication. An indirect test, on the other hand, is aimed at one or more of the sub-skills related to the skill we want to assess. Usually, this means the building blocks of language ability, such as grammar knowledge, vocabulary size, oral word recognition or pronunciation, etc. For example, writing an essay requires vocabulary, grammar, spelling, etc., so to some extent, a grammar test might indirectly test writing ability. Because oral communication requires listening ability to interact with a partner, a listening comprehension test might indirectly test communication ability. Similarly, because writing and speaking are both productive skills, a timed written response might be used to indirectly test oral communication. Clearly, indirect tests are not as valid as direct tests. However, they are often more practical and may be a worthwhile compromise when direct tests are not possible. Another useful distinction is objective versus subjective scoring. Objective scoring is based on an answer key and requires no judgment. Objective scoring could be done by a machine. Subjective scoring is based on performance descriptors and is affected by the characteristics of the scorer or rater. For example, raters can be strict or lenient, that is, a tough grader or an easy grader. They can also have different values, that is, they might have different beliefs about what is important in a language performance. For example, some raters might base their scores on grammatical accuracy but ignore pronunciation, while others believe that good pronunciation is much more important than having perfect grammar. When these and other characteristics of the raters have a strong influence on the scores, the assessment becomes unreliable and unfair. Specifically, we refer to this as inter-rater reliability. Inter-rater reliability refers to how well a group of teachers or raters can agree on the subjective scores they award to a performance. Ideally, raters should award the same score to the same performance. However, perfect inter-rater reliability may not be possible. Instead, we should work to make judgments as consistent as we can. For review, reliability, as you studied earlier, refers to whether the score is accurate and reproducible. Would the student get the same score if he or she took the test again? With subjective scores, in addition to how well the students perform on the assessment, we also need to ask two additional questions. Are different teachers consistent in how they score a performance? That is, do we have good inter-rater reliability? We also need to ask whether individual teachers are affected by mood, fatigue, or bias. For example, if the assessment requires a teacher to conduct many short interviews in a day, the teacher's ratings may become inconsistent due to being tired. Teachers may also wish to award higher scores to students they know have tried very hard in class, even if their performance was not so strong. This is referred to as intra-rater reliability. To improve the reliability of subjective assessments, keep the following points in mind. First, more is better. This means more observations to score. For example, more questions, more conversations, longer conversations, more raters. All of these improve reliability. Next, rubrics. A rubric is a written guide for deciding subjective scores. Decide in advance what criteria are important in your assessment. What do you expect to observe at different levels of performance? The assessment designer should write descriptors of each level of performance in the rubric. The more detailed the descriptors are, the more reliable subjective assessments become. Finally, calibrate. Practice scoring with colleagues. Use exemplars. Exemplars are recorded examples of different levels of performance to compare. All of these points will improve reliability of subjective assessments. We are now ready to consider some specific ways to assess speaking performance. The first thing to consider are the grouping options. To assess speaking, we must first decide the format and context of the speech. There are various options that can be used. For example, an individual speech, a student-teacher interview, a pair of students observed by a teacher, or a group discussion observed by one or perhaps even two teachers. Each method has advantages and disadvantages. Let's compare them one by one, beginning with the prepared speech format. Prepared speeches have many practical advantages. First, they can be easy and practical to organize. For example, a teacher could arrange 3 to 5 2-minute speeches at the beginning of each class for a semester. However, because only one student speaks at a time, speeches can be time-consuming. Teachers can target language to some degree by assigning topics such as "my future dream" in advance. Because speeches follow a predictable pattern, teachers can evaluate them reliably using a rubric. On the other hand, because a speech is prepared and rehearsed, it may not be a very good measure of communication ability. There is no interaction to observe, and the assessment may reward presentation and memorization ability as much as English ability. Finally, some students are very prone to public speaking anxiety. They may not be able to do their best if they become very nervous about speaking in front of others. A one-on-one teacher-student interview is one of the best methods for assessing oral communication ability. It is a valid, direct test of communication. A main advantage is that the teacher can control the language through questions, asking for additional details, or recasting. Recasting refers to a technique where the teacher repeats an utterance made by the student, correcting vocabulary or grammar errors. If the student is aware of these errors, he or she can indicate that by repeating the utterance with corrections. Like speeches, teacher-student interviews are practical to organize but time-consuming. Because the teacher is busy doing the interview, work must be found for other students. Finally, reliability may suffer because the teacher is both participating and scoring. Because the teacher needs to direct and participate in the conversation, he or she has less attention to devote to evaluating the student. Fatigue can be a problem if the teacher is conducting many interviews in a single session. Another format is student pairs. Two students perform together. The teacher observes and evaluates. Organizing students into pairs and assessing them together saves time and has several other advantages. There are many variations on this format. Each has advantages and disadvantages. Variations include a memorized dialogue. This is efficient, but it is not communication. It is valid for fluency and pronunciation assessment only. However, it can be a good format for lower-level students. It gives them a chance to get used to a performance assessment. Another approach is a structured role play. In role plays, only the situation is described. Students must either prepare or improvise the language. Role plays are somewhat more communicative, but important communicative skills like topic and turn management may not be covered. Yet another variation is free conversation on an assigned topic. The teacher may announce the topic in advance or assign it on the spot. Or a compromise, announce 3 possible topics in advance and assign one of them randomly on the spot. This format is communicative, But performances can be very interdependent. A weak speaker can hold back a stronger speaker, or the stronger speaker could intimidate the weaker speaker. Also, students may have prior social relationships that influence their performances. For example, if they don't like each other, it can make the conversation awkward. If they are close friends, they can rely on shared knowledge and understanding of their partner. To summarize some advantages and disadvantages of assessing speaking with student pairs, assessing two students at once saves time. The format has good validity because it reflects what students are doing in class and resembles real-world communication. Generally, this format has good reliability because the teacher does not participate. He or she can give complete attention to observing, assessing, and providing feedback. On the other hand, students with a weak partner may be disadvantaged. Finally, if topics are announced in advance, students may rehearse and memorize their performances. This could decrease validity, especially if the goal of the assessment is to test oral communication ability. In the group discussion format, 3 or 4 students perform together, discussing a topic assigned by the teacher. As with student pairs, the topic may be assigned in advance or assigned on the spot. The group discussion format has many advantages. First, it has high validity both as a speaking assessment and assessment of oral communication. If students have been practicing discussions in class, it reflects what they are doing in class as well as real-life discussion. Compared to student pairs, it is more difficult to rehearse and memorize the performance. The group discussion format is practical. 4 students can be assessed at once, so it is a very efficient use of time. On the other hand, shy students may be disadvantaged in large groups. They may struggle to take part in the discussion. But a good way to work around that problem is to award extra points for leadership. If leadership is an evaluation criterion, the teacher can give credit to students who may help weak or shy students to participate. This will motivate group members to include everyone in their discussion. Another disadvantage is that group discussions can be challenging to organize. They may require space outside of the classroom. The teacher must assign groups in advance and decide how they will be called. We will next talk about rubrics and protocols. A rubric defines how a performance will be scored. A protocol defines how the assessment will be organized and carried out. Let's look at both of these in a bit more detail. A protocol is a detailed written description of the procedure of an assessment. It can be used to evaluate practicality and to ensure that things run smoothly. Protocols include the time needed per student, including time to move or change seats, any special equipment such as audio players, recorders, etc., extra rooms or furniture if needed, including a description of furniture layout or arrangement. Protocols should be written and detailed. The more detailed, the easier it will be to implement the speaking assessment consistently. Protocols can also help improve assessments over time. After an assessment is finished, The procedures can be reviewed and improved for future administrations. Any unexpected problems that occurred can be noted and revised if the assessment is used again. A rubric is a written guide used to evaluate a spoken or written performance. Rubrics are the equivalent of a scoring key for an objective assessment and are essential for reliably assessing a spoken performance. A well-designed rubric can increase reliability of the assessment, especially if more than one teacher is evaluating. More importantly, a good rubric can create positive washback for clarifying goals and desired outcomes to students. This helps learners better prepare for the performance. A good rubric can also be used for feedback. This helps learners better understand their strengths and weaknesses so that they can set goals and better prepare for a future assessment. A rubric has 3 parts and is organized as a table with rows and columns. The 3 parts are the criteria. These are the aspects of performance, such as grammar, pronunciation, attitude, etc., that will be assessed. Levels are the degrees of success, such as excellent, satisfactory, poor, etc., for each criterion. Levels determine the number of points awarded for each criterion. In fact, levels can simply be the number of points. Labels such as excellent or needs work can be helpful but are not necessary. Finally, descriptors. Descriptors are short, concrete descriptions of a typical performance for each level of each criterion. The descriptors are the most important part of the rubric. They specifically guide teachers in what to look for when they decide their subjective scores. Descriptors can also be used, perhaps with simplified language, to guide students when preparing for the assessment and to give feedback when the assessment is finished. This style of rubric is called an analytic rubric. An analytic rubric includes a descriptor for each level of each criterion. Let's take a closer look at an analytic rubric designed to assess a prepared speech. First, take a moment to look over the rubric. What are the criteria for assessing this 3-minute speech? How many levels of performance are there? Read over the descriptors. Do they make logical sense? Do you think they progress logically through the performance levels? I will pause the lecture for a few seconds while you look the rubric over. Pause the movie if you would like more time. Have you had time to look over the rubric? Let's go over it. First, this rubric calls for assessing the speech using 5 criteria, which include intelligibility, fluency, and accuracy, as well as points for posture and gestures and the content of the speech. There are 4 labeled levels of performance, but notice that the rubric allows for 5 points for each criteria, and there are no descriptors for 2 points and 4 points. These would fall in between fair and good and excellent. Do you think this is a good idea? Should raters be allowed to give 2 points or 4 points? In my experience, no matter how many levels your rubric includes, Some raters will insist on using in-between or half scores. Designing a rubric in this way allows the raters to do that. It also cuts down on the number of descriptors that are necessary. Personally, I think this is a good design feature, but others may disagree. Did you read through the descriptors? Do you think they make a logical progression through the levels? Let's take a close look at the fluency descriptors. Notice how the language is concrete in describing pauses. We have frequent long pauses, frequent pauses that distracted, occasional short pauses that did not distract, and well rehearsed with no substantial pauses. Do you think these are detailed enough for most teachers to consistently grade fluency based on the frequency and effect of pauses in the speech? We can see similar language in other descriptors, such as eye contact, as well. Words like frequent, occasional, few or minor, etc., can guide teachers in basing their subjective scores on things we can observe. They are also helpful in giving feedback to learners who ask questions, such as, "Why did I get only 2 points for accuracy, but my friend got 3?" A teacher can then easily explain that her grammar errors sometimes interfered with understanding, while her friend's errors overall did not. One more thing about the descriptors to point out is that a performance does not need to be perfect or like a native to receive a score of excellent. Descriptors for excellent still allow for a few minor errors or pauses. Avoid making descriptors that will not be achievable by anyone in your group. Try to design the rubric so that all categories will be used, with the possible exception of 0 points. It is demotivating to get the lowest score for anyone who made an effort. So we usually like to use the lowest level only for students who fail to make any effort at all. Before we move on, I want to mention another style of rubric called a holistic rubric. A holistic rubric describes several criteria within a single descriptor. If you pause and read the holistic descriptors above, you will notice that the descriptor for a score of 5 mentions fluency, accuracy, and pronunciation. It also describes specifically what grammar features should be considered for a score of 5. Descriptors for lower scores may describe specific features, such as characterized by frequent long pauses for a score of 3, but may also use general descriptions, such as lacking in one of the points mentioned above, as in the descriptor for a score of 4. Holistic rubrics may be simpler to use because only one score needs to be decided. No calculation is needed for the final total score. On the other hand, they are less helpful for giving students feedback, as it may not be clear which of the points was lacking in the performance. In my experience, holistic rubrics may also result in lower inter-rater reliability. Even with training, discussion, and practice, some teachers will still tend to apply their own criteria if they only need to decide a single score. It is much more difficult for teachers to do that with an analytic rubric. However, holistic rubrics can be quite practical for tasks such as picture stories. Finally, I want to mention what I call an incomplete or quasi-rubric. I don't consider these to be genuine rubrics because they do not have descriptors. The marks indicate levels only. Quasi-rubrics can be a convenient way to report grades back to students, but they are not helpful for improving inter-rater reliability or for giving feedback to students. If used without any additional supporting documents, each teacher can decide for themselves what qualifies as satisfactory or outstanding. By themselves, these incomplete rubrics do not provide answers to student questions, such as, why was my content only satisfactory and not outstanding? However, this kind of form may be used together with a complete analytic rubric to conveniently mark and record scores. If used that way, it is important that both teachers and students have easy access to the descriptors so that they can reliably award and interpret subjective scores. Let's next take a look at another useful technique for assessing speaking. When designing a speaking assessment, don't overlook the value of using pictures for speaking prompts. Brown and Abewick-Rama give many hints and examples of picture-cued elicitation techniques in their chapter on assessing speaking. A single picture can be used in many ways, even within a single assessment. For example, in a teacher-student interview format for lower-level students who are not used to speaking assessments, the teacher can begin by asking the student only to indicate understanding by pointing to the correct picture. This can also prime the student with the language which the teacher hopes to elicit in the speaking section. The teacher can gradually work toward more open-ended tasks, first asking specific questions about a specified picture, and finally asking the student to speak freely about a specified picture. Picture stories are used to elicit spoken language by ACAN and other commercial tests. Practice tests can be found online by searching Google Images, using phrases such as ACAN Grade 2 Interview Sample Questions. These kinds of picture stories have been designed to elicit sentences with a simple past or past progressive verb tense, as well as complex sentences with adverbs, prepositional phrases, or verb complements. For this type of task, which is usually done in the teacher-student interview format, a holistic rubric might be adequate and practical. It is now time to discuss the Module 3 assignment, which is to design a speaking assessment suitable for students you are teaching, and then to share your assessment with others in the class. As with the multiple choice reading items, we will look over each other's speaking assessments and give feedback. Your speaking assessment should include the following: a protocol. This should give a general description of the procedures for the assessment, including grouping format, time allotted, administrative details, such as where the assessment takes place and how you will smoothly call students to the assessment, etc. A rubric. This should be a rubric of your own design. You can use an analytic rubric or a holistic rubric, but be sure to include adequate descriptors. This is the most important part of the assignment, and I believe seeing other teachers' rubrics will be the most informative part of the assignment. If your assessment makes use of a picture to elicit language, be sure to share it. Let's quickly review the steps in designing a rubric. To design a good rubric, the teacher must, first, decide what criteria to use: grammar, pronunciation, content, eye contact, etc. Be focused. 3 to 5 criteria is about right. More than 5 is difficult to manage when scoring many students. Next, decide the number of levels and label them. 3 or 4 is usually enough. More than 4 is difficult to manage. But more importantly, it becomes difficult to write descriptors that clearly differentiate the levels. Then, write descriptors describing each level of performance for each criterion. Write descriptors that match your students. Avoid unrealistic descriptors that your students cannot achieve, such as pronunciation was the same as a native. Descriptors work best when they are concrete and task-specific. Avoid very general descriptions, such as content was well organized and easy to follow. Instead, use language that is specific to the task, such as opinions were supported with 3 or more reasons or examples for a discussion, or made an appropriate greeting and conclusion for a speech, or was shorter than the required length to indicate why a student did not attain the highest level. Finally, if you believe a holistic rubric is best for your designed assessment, combine the descriptors from each level into a single holistic description. However, even if you plan from the beginning to make a holistic rubric, I recommend you follow the steps above and combine descriptors as a final step. I have scanned and uploaded Chapter 8, Assessing Speaking, from Language Assessment. It is a long chapter, but it contains many tips and ideas for assessing speaking. Please read it or skim through relevant parts to further guide you in designing your speaking assessment. That is the end of the lecture for Module 3. Good luck with your speaking assessment assignment.